thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. I should have realized that business casual in a government conference means you wear your blue suit rather than your black suit on a Sunday. So I'm sorry I'm a little underdressed. But the subject of my talk will be growing the next big idea. And what I want to share with you are some of the things we've learned in both Silicon Valley, working with government agencies, working with small businesses and large corporations on how to build new ventures and create new jobs. We've learned a whole lot of new things in the last couple of years, and I thought I'd share them with you in the form of 4 lessons. Lesson 1, the different types of startups. Lesson 2, what a startup ecosystem looks like. Lesson 3, and kind of the most important, at least for me, is we think we know now how to make startups fail less, which is kind of a polite way to say over a large number of them, we actually know how to make startups succeed more. And then the last question is, can we actually teach what we now know on how to build companies and create jobs? And I'm going to share those with you as quickly as I can, and then take questions at the end. So lesson 1, types of startups. You know, one of the things that confused me when I left industry, I had done startups for 21 years. And to me, a startup was a high technology, high growth, you woke up in the morning and your goal was to build a billion-dollar company. And I started attending other professors' lectures and heard them start talking about startups in a language and descriptions that I had never heard before, until I realized that we were using the same word to describe multiple things. It turns out that there are different types of startups. Number 1, a lifestyle startup. People who work to live their passion. They serve known customers, they have known products. The example in California, since we're near the beach, is surfers who love to surf. Hang up a sign on their surf shack that says lessons 9:30 to 10:45 a.m. They make enough money, they put the close sign up and they go out surfing. These individuals are doing startups. They are self-employed. But they are creating jobs maybe for themselves and maybe for 1 or 2 assistants. There's another type of startup which is really popular on college campuses, social entrepreneurship startups. These are entrepreneurs who want to dedicate their lives to solving pressing social problems. They either want to build a company to do that and make it profitable, Ben & Jerry's, 7th Generation, etc., or they want to create new social innovation in new nonprofits. Their goal is to go from a social startup into a large nonprofit. Another type of startup is the one that my parents actually started. My parents were immigrants to the United States. I'm a first-generation American. Their dream in this country was to open up a grocery store. And they worked in sweatshops in New York for 15 years, saving every dime they had, and finally they were able to do that. What I didn't realize at the time is my parents were entrepreneurs. They did a startup. Their goal in setting up a grocery store was to serve a known customer with known products, and if they were successful, they were able to feed our family. And some days they weren't successful and we were just eating stuff off the stock of the shelves. But in others, eventually, they grew the business. And what's really interesting is their exit criteria wasn't $1 billion, wasn't even $1 million. In fact, if they made $500,000 in their entire lives, it's probably $400,000 too much. Their goal was to build a profitable business and find a business model that is, who are their customers, what can they charge, what products should they carry, and they did it with an existing team. Now, what's interesting is in Silicon Valley, we kind of look down at small businesses and say, these are lifestyle businesses. And that's a mistake. Because small businesses are the heart of the U.S. economy. There are 5.7 million small businesses in the U.S., and they make up 99.7% of all companies. They employ about 50% of all non-governmental workers. Small businesses are entrepreneurs. They do startups. And it's a type of startup we actually need to think about and figure out whether the processes we're using and building for technology startups can be applied to them, and I'm going to show you how we could do that. The other type of startup, which gets all the press, are what I call scalable startups, sometimes called high-growth startups. These are the ones you see in the news all the time. This is Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak when they first started. A scalable startup is designed to grow big. These founders wake up in the morning and say, we're going to build a company that's going to take over the universe. Now, one or two things are true. Number one is they're visionaries, or two, more than likely, they're hallucinating. Okay? But a scalable startup not only is designed to grow big from day one, it typically needs risk capital. And risk capital is a fancy word for venture capital or angel funding or some type of private capital that's used to dealing with risk. Because what I'll mention multiple times is for this class of startup, over 90% of them fail. Let me say it again. Over 90% of scalable startups fail. Now, who would be crazy enough to invest in anything like that? Well, I guess the housing market, but besides the housing market, what we have is a startup class that most fail, but the returns are so large and so huge, they attract a special asset class, risk capital. And so the goal is to solve for unknown customers, and what they're looking for are markets $500 million or greater, and they want to grow to $100 million a year in revenue. There's a new type of startup in Silicon Valley and in your states that is emerging only in the last couple of years. And I call these buyable startups. And a buyable startup are typically software companies built around engineers developing applications for mobile phones, for the web, or for the cloud. And for the first time, it no longer takes millions of dollars to start these companies. These are being started on credit cards, on laptops, using resources on the web. And while you think these just might be small little companies, Instagram, which was what I would call a buyable startup, got sold for $1 billion to Facebook. There's a new class of startups that don't require large amounts of capital. And their goal typically is to sell to a larger company. The last type of startups, which you wouldn't believe are startups, are large companies. Large companies do innovation in your states all the time. And what they mostly do is what a professor in Harvard, Clayton Christensen, called sustaining innovation. Large corporations, to stay in business, have to continually innovate around their core products. They need to make them faster and smarter and cheaper. But something's happened in the last 2 decades that are really changing the nature of large corporations. And that's, in fact, that the cycle time, the amount of time they have to stay on the top of the pack, has been incredibly compressed by globalization, by technology shifts, by regulatory shifts. And in fact, large corporations not only now need to deal with existing markets and known customers and known products, they need to deal with disruption. And disruption is when they have a great core business and some crazy comes along and says, we're going to take out this company. The best examples of this are 2 of the smartest companies. Anybody ever have a BlackBerry or a Nokia phone? I was in Finland talking to someone who was at the Nokia board meeting the month the iPhone came out. They passed a copy of the iPhone around at the Nokia board meeting, and the fatal quote was, "Why should we care about this? What's their market share?" On day one, to a large corporation, disruption looks like a toy. It's a big idea. A disruptive innovation to a big existing company always looks like a toy on day one. It has 0 share. That's not what Nokia and RIM are thinking now. And I use those as examples because those were smart, great companies that every year were doing great sustaining innovation, but didn't understand that they were being disrupted. And so how large corporations need to deal with disruption is they could either build their own disruptive technology, they could partner with other companies, or they could acquire startup technology, intellectual property, talent, products, customers, or entire businesses. And disruptive innovation inside a large corporation looks exactly like a corporate startup. So now we kind of have the types of startups. And the summary for this first piece is the policies, funding, and tactics in each of your states to deal with small business startups, scalable startups, corporate startups. The tactics are different, but the techniques I'm going to show you a little later are identical. We now understand what's common between them. So just hold on a second. The second thing I thought I'd share is the history of a startup ecosystem. I spent my last 34 years in Silicon Valley, and I kind of got used to the fact that we have a technology ecosystem, an infrastructure that feeds on itself, but never quite understanding where it came from. And in fact, the reason I'm going to share this with you is I now do a talk called The Secret History of Silicon Valley, which you could find on YouTube. The reason why is when I asked some of my engineering students, where did Silicon Valley come from? They said, oh, some old guy named Steve Jobs started it. And I went, well, perhaps and then I asked my other friends, well, you know, what was the government's role? Well, the government had no role. It was all about venture capital. So I just want to share with you a thumbnail sketch about this ecosystem, and more importantly, not about the valley, but what is it that we could extract? What are the rules that we kind of can learn from Silicon Valley? Silicon Valley was a series of unintended consequences. It was not designed. Number one is it started with Stanford University, an outward-facing research university. By outward-facing, meaning it had deep university, military, and industrial ties from day one, building weapon systems. During the middle of the Cold War, Stanford's engineering department had a secret 400-person weapons lab building electronic warfare and electronic intelligence systems, funded by the DoD and all our intelligence agencies. At the same time, there was massive government R&D in weapon systems. Silicon Valley in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s was not a startup center. It was a defense center. Lockheed Missiles and Space, which set up its facility in Sunnyvale, California in 1956, had 0 employees. In 1960, it had 25,000 engineers working in what would become Silicon Valley, building the Polaris, Poseidon, and Trident submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And at the same time, building all the overhead reconnaissance satellites for the CIA, NSA, and National Reconnaissance Office, Corona, Gambit, Hexagon, and others. Silicon Valley started by massive government funding, by accident. And one professor connected this government, military, and engineering culture into an entrepreneurial culture. It was Fred Terman, professor from Stanford, who ended up as dean of engineering and then provost of the university, said, look, we'll do government research in our labs, but any production of systems, I want my students to spin out and start companies. And in fact, it's great for the country. This is the 1950s. If my academic researchers, my professors, sit on boards, become advisors, invest in all these startups, I want my engineering department to face outward as well as facing inward. And that was a radical shift in the 1950s and 60s, and the culture of Silicon Valley started with this one professor who said it was great to take our inventions and help the country in the middle of the Cold War. By the way, venture capital, that is investing in startups, actually, believe it or not, was started by our response to the launch of Sputnik, the first Soviet satellite, in October 1957. U.S. Congress decided that we were falling behind the Soviets in technology and launched a series of programs, NASA, ARPA, and also launched a program called the Small Business Investment Corporation as part of the SBA that would match 3-to-1 any investments in new companies. And so the first set of venture capital was actually an unintended consequence of Sputnik. And in fact, venture capital was, in fact, government funded. By the mid-1960s, 3/4 of all the VC firms in the U.S. were SBIC programs. It was only until the invention of something called the limited partnership in the late 60s and the 70s that venture capital took the form that we needed, and we now use, which does not use government money. And then in the late 1970s, regulatory changes changed venture capital once again. All of a sudden, pension funds were now allowed, through the prudent man rule, to invest up to 10% in, quote, risky ventures. And the amount of capital available to Silicon Valley investors went from millions to billions of dollars literally within a year. And venture capital, as we know it, took off in the late 1970s. There's two key lessons from this whole soliloquy. One is, we built a culture that embraced technology risk. We recognize that 90% of startups fail. Imagine in your states if 90% of your programs failed. Turns out in our culture, failure equals experience. We understand that these are the risks, and more importantly, the culture embraced financial risk. Investors who invested in these companies understood that 90% would fail, and so did their limited partners. They also understood that it was the 10% that would return unbelievable amounts of capital. And so they were investing to find, out of those 10, 20, 30 companies in their portfolio, the one or two that would become the Apples or the Googles or the Facebook. And what they brought to Silicon Valley was not just money. And if I emphasize anything here, it's the importance of smart capital if you're trying to build an entrepreneurial culture. By smart capital, it is not writing checks to entrepreneurs. That's dumb money. What you really want is experienced advice, tolerance for risk, and long-term interests. Startups take years, in some of them decades, to come to fruition. And you need people who've had the experience and understand what it takes to coach an early-stage venture from a napkin into a billion-dollar company. So what lessons can we learn to build innovation without Cold War funding? One is that it really requires an ecosystem. I won't bore you with a graph, but it requires infrastructure. I mentioned some of the other things in this slide: research universities, economic systems, legal systems, 24/7 utilities, because when I show this in other countries rather than other states, some of those things on the right really aren't even available there. But for your states, number one is to think about research universities. That is a place to start thinking about building a core of innovation. The second is culture. Startup culture is very different than building normal businesses. We take risks, we build on each other's expertise in accelerators and incubators, and we like our universities to learn how to be outward-facing. We've now developed a series of management tools that I will show you in a minute that we've now learned how to make startups fail less. It's a big idea. And the motivation for the ecosystem is capitalism. If there's anything to remember about startups, is it's not just about the great entrepreneurs. It's about the ecosystem that's a circle between startups and risk capital who make enormous profit by funding most of them who will fail. And it's building this ecosystem that's critical in getting any entrepreneurial cluster off the ground. So here's a sum of what it would look like, but let me just point out the lessons. The lessons are here that we want to understand that entrepreneurship requires a healthy ecosystem of all these pieces. But at the end of the day, unless you have investors who are not acting like bankers, but are acting like venture capitalists and experienced angel investors, you will just have a pile of very smart entrepreneurs looking around for money. And the best thing that we could do is figure out how to encourage that top part of the ecosystem. So lesson 3, making startups fail less. Here's some lessons that we've learned in the last couple of years that I think are fairly critical and are going to be counterintuitive to everything you might know. After 50 years of Silicon Valley history, we now know how to build startups. First of all, in Silicon Valley, we take more technical risk per square foot than probably any other place in the world. More technical risk. And you would think startups would fail because the technology fails. It turns out over 95% of startups that fail because they didn't find customers and markets. It's not because their technology didn't work, though it's never on time, I will guarantee you. I guess the engineers in the room are laughing. But it's because they don't find enough customers and markets. It's a big idea. While we're investing in the technology, the things that don't work for these companies is, oh, we didn't know who our customers were, or we priced it wrong, or we had the wrong distribution channel. Yet what's really interesting is how we used to build companies. We used to believe that startups were nothing more than smaller versions of large companies. Now this is really interesting. If I'm a business school professor and I was consulting for a large corporation that had 10, 20, 100,000 people, and I was helping them, I'd say, how hard could it be to give advice to a startup? There's two guys in a garage. You know, these just must be smaller versions of large companies. So everything that we've learned in the last 100 years about building large corporations, we're just going to tell startups to go do. And that's what we did for 50 years in Silicon Valley. We said, oh, we got it. They're smaller versions. We now know that they're not. And this is a huge insight. We now know that startups search for something and large companies execute. And what that means is startups are searching for who their customers are, what their channel is, how to price the product, etc. Large companies have been around for a while and they know who their customers are and they know how to price the product. This distinction between search and execution is not just a set of words. It's actually the difference on how we would build these things. What we used to believe is that all we have to do is write a business plan. Anybody ever see a startup business plan, right? Or a business plan from one of your organizations? Yeah, it's a nice document and it's big. Well, we now know we actually have an actual photo of what happens when the plan has first contact with customers. I now found this photo that absolutely represents what it looks like. Right? What we now know is that there's no possible way that you could write down in a document sitting in your office or your library or with consultants what the real world looks like. The real world is chaos. But if all we're trying to do is make a plan, we've gotten ahead of ourselves. And by the way, if you've ever seen a plan, everybody knows Appendix A is the 5-year forecast, right? We love forecasts. It's tell me what the future is going to be like. And you're sitting here going, I don't even know what tomorrow's going to be looking like, but my investors want a forecast. Okay, I'll type it. I always tell my students there's a secret Excel key code that will auto-generate this, and they're still looking for this now. But no one in the history of entrepreneurship ever said, who else used to do 5-year plans, and how successful were they? And these were the only guys who used to do 5-year plans. And we know how this ended up. And so, really, if we think about this, what's wrong with this? By the way, I'm not suggesting we never do planning and never do forecasts. I am not suggesting that. I am suggesting for a startup, what is it that we now know? What we now know is no business plan survives first contact with customers. The reason why is we tend to write it with certainty, but with no facts. So searching comes before you write this plan, and the question is searching for what? And this starts by first defining what the heck is a startup. So let me give you Steve's definition of a startup, because I never had one as an entrepreneur doing 8 startups. I never even knew what is it am I supposed to be doing other than it's fun serving dinner at night and free food and you can bring your dog to work, but what exactly is a startup? Number one, which was a real shock for me thinking about it, a startup is a temporary organization. The goal is not to say a startup. In fact, there's no such thing as a 10-year-old startup. There's a 2-year-old startup attached to an 8-year-old failure. 2 is, a startup is designed to search for something that's repeatable and scalable. Repeatable means I could do the same thing on Monday, it works on Friday. Scalable says I put $1 in, I get 1 times N dollars out, for a repeatable and scalable business model. Now this is kind of interesting because this all made sense to the word business model. What the heck is a business model? I thought my job is to build the product or to get customers. What do you mean searching for a business model? So let me give you a quick definition. A business model is how a company creates value for itself and its customers. And it basically says, look, while your company is about your product, it's also about your customers and your channels. That is how you get your product to the customers, about how you create demand, how do you get revenue, how much does stuff cost, you need partners, and what do you need to do, activities and resources. That is, a business model is all these pieces. And on a day one, most startups just have guesses. Because all these guesses are, in fact, at Stanford, because students pay $50,000 a year, I don't use the word guesses, I use the word hypotheses, because it actually makes them feel they're getting value for their money. But in other places outside of major universities, we just call them guesses. If you really think about it, on day one, a startup is a faith-based enterprise. It truly is. It's driven by its vision and irrational passion of its founders. The mistake is continuing to operate it as faith-based, because what you truly want to do is turn that faith into facts as quickly as possible. And that's the big insight. It's okay to start it with a faith-based hypothesis, because you're guessing about a lot of things. And so what we really want to do is draw this business model on the wall, put stickies on them, etc. But now, how do we change these guesses into facts? And that's the invention we came up with in the last couple of years, and that's called the customer development process. It says everything you know or think you know is a guess. So let's get out of the building in a formal process and start testing this a step at a time. And we could test this incredibly rapidly. Now, the last thing we kind of know, and this is something that took me decades to understand. In a startup, it used to be that when you failed, you made a mistake, you picked the wrong customers, you didn't make your revenue, you fired the VP of sales. And when that didn't work, you fired the VP of marketing. And when that didn't work, you fired the CEO and you shut the company down. But we now know that most of the time, startups go from failure to failure. This is a big idea. Startups don't go from success to success. It only happens in the movies. So the question is, what do you do when the hypotheses don't match reality? We've come up with a term called the pivot. The pivot says, look, this is going to happen all the time. So why don't we just embrace the fact that failure will happen, and when it does, we'll change some of our business model. We'll either change the customers or the channel or the pricing, and it's okay as long as we have cash left. And if we embrace the fact that this is part of the process, we'll fire the hypotheses before we fire the founders and executives. And that's a huge insight about early-stage ventures. And so pivots are the result of all these out-of-the-building hypotheses, testing, and experimentation. And we do this with speed, and we do it on a tempo, and we do it with a rational focus. So summary, making startups fail less. Big idea, takeaway is startups are not smaller versions of large companies. Huge. All the tools and techniques that any of you or your staff has learned in business school for the last 100 years, we've actually taught great tools for execution. Remember, an MBA, Masters of Business Administration, not the master of starting companies. Those tools are excellent for growing large corporations. But we never had our own tools for building early-stage ventures. We just kind of try to adopt these old tools. What we now know is that before you do a plan, whether it's an operating plan or a financial model, you want to actually run a customer development and business model process before you write the plan. And so the interesting question is, if you believe any of this, can we teach it? So we've put together a class in these universities, Stanford, Berkeley, Columbia, Caltech, and we've also put it together for the National Science Foundation. Within 8 weeks, we get teams in front of 100 customers. We're not talking about doing a survey. We're talking about out of the building. 100 customers. Now, you've got to be deaf, dumb, and blind not to get some feedback talking to 100 customers. And not only do I do it for these universities, but last year the US government adopted this process. The National Science Foundation now uses this, they call this the Innovation Corps, to teach the top scientists and engineers in the country to get out of their labs, and we do the same thing. Except this time, instead of 22-year-olds in hoodies and flip-flops, We're doing it with 45-year-old tenured professors who probably haven't left their lab since their PhD oral defense. And we could make them, and we have made them, work as fast as these early stage ventures. The National Science Foundation thought this was so productive, they are now scaling this to teach hundreds of teams of our best scientists in the United States, and other researcher organizations of the country are adopting this same class. And you will see other announcements. In fact, NSF is going to have a major announcement this coming Wednesday. Because it was the National Science Foundation, they instrumented this class. And they said, Steve, okay, we hear you, we hear this business model, customer development stuff, blah, blah, blah. Prove to us it works. So what they did was surveyed students about knowledge coming into the class. What did you know? And the orange bars on the left are essentially we didn't know anything. And if we were successful, we would move the orange bars to the right to kind of like some and a great deal. So here was what they knew coming into the class. Here's what they knew going out. So number one, we were able to say, we actually taught them a lot about how to build startups. But you know what? That wasn't the goal. That was kind of nice. What we wanted to do if we could teach them how to commercialize their technology and build companies. So what did the data say about building companies? Again, what did you know about building companies? Coming into the class, after the class. And the National Science Foundation kind of said, I think we have something for the first time in 30 years that bridges the gap between basic research and SBIR and STTR grants, which is their funding for commercialization. And they were pretty impressed that we had a process that works. But for me, I wasn't satisfied. While it's nice to teach the elite in our country, if you remember, my definition of entrepreneurship embraces small business, large corporations, and the rest. And because my parents and my background was small business, my question was, well, what about the other 99%? Because this same generic process, the same customer development, business model design, worked for grocery stores, dry cleaners, small businesses trying to get off the ground. Could they use this technique? Because if you go to the SBA.gov site, guess what they tell you to do?